So we're going to talk about the philosophers who, as I said, were not necessarily the true thinkers or professional philosophers, but they were the popularizers of Enlightenment ideas. And some of the most famous examples of male Enlightenment thinkers were Fontenelle, Bayle, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, and of the Scottish Enlightenment, which came a little later, David Hume, the Physiocrats, and Adam Smith, who you may have heard of in another context, since he's also known as sort of the so-called father of capitalism. But let's start with Fontenelle, who himself was not really a great scientist. He was actually not really a scientist himself. He did not experiment or make any great discoveries, but he did understand science deeply, and he was able to articulate it in a way that others could understand, like normal people like us. So he was actually the secretary of the French Royal Academy of Science from 1691 to 1741, and he was a master of teaching it and making it accessible to non-science folk like me. So he was very important. Another one was Pierre Bayle, who was a French philosopher as well. He happened to be a Huguenot. So if you remember, especially my AP students might remember this, Huguenots were French Protestants who were heavily persecuted through many centuries in France because the predominant religion was Catholic. But they did gain some rights, and under Henry IV, and then they lost some of those rights under Louis XIV. But Pierre Bayle was a Huguenot, and so that put him in an interesting position. He definitely believed in God, but he was skeptical of many of the traditional religious attitudes, and he introduced something called textual criticism, where you take you take writings like biblical writings and you try to understand them in their historical context rather than over spiritualizing them. So for example, he wrote a pretty scathing commentary or view of King David. He also argued for complete religious toleration, which is very understandable given the fact that he is a minority religion in France, which was, like I said, very strongly Catholic. And so he argued for toleration and for individual conscience being able to determine one's actions. And so again, sort of like in the vein of Martin Luther, that he had to follow his conscience. So he is very much introducing this idea that one should think for themselves and use their own conscience to determine their actions. He did attack intolerance and dogmatism well. But of all the Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire was the most prolific, meaning he produced a lot of literature, and also the most famous. Voltaire was an interesting character, to say the least. He was born in Paris. He had a Jesuit education, but he strongly rejected the Christian faith. He was exiled a number of times for his, and just to place this in context, Voltaire was 21 years old when Louis XIV died. He was perhaps the most famous person of 18th century Europe. He wrote poetry, he was a dramatist, he wrote essays, he was a historian, a novelist, a philosopher, and a scientist, and he was perpetually arguing for tolerance, reason, freedom from religion, freedom of speech, etc. And his genius lay in his ability to debate and ridicule, to mock beliefs that he did not agree with. So his religious beliefs were that he believed in God, but he was deist, as we talked about before, which meant he believed somebody had to make everything, but that creator does not intervene in regular human affairs. He had a strong undercurrent of skepticism in his thinking. He rejected the doctrine of hell and what he perceived to be the dogmatism and narrowness of the institutional church and the tendency of the church to persecute people who didn't go along with what they said. He rejected the claim of the church to have the absolute revealed truth, which he thought was so incredible that it was not to be believed, that anyone could have a sort of a corner on the truth like the church claimed to. And you will read some of Voltaire's works, or at least excerpts from his works, and kind of experience that for yourself. Montesquieu was another French philosopher who studied political liberty. He had studied ancient Rome and saw the fall of Rome as a result of the loss of liberties there as the empire was sort of decaying. And like Voltaire, he thought Britain had the best government, 3 branches, an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. And he called this a separation of powers, although he didn't really understand the English system. He kind of oversimplified it. But he ended up writing On the Spirit of the Laws in 1748 to talk about the fact that governments needed a series of checks and balances. And so really it was Montesquieu's ideas that became the basis of the U.S. Constitution. Diderot was also a French philosopher. He was unique in that, as I think I mentioned before, was actually an atheist, not a deist. He said, "This world is only a mass of molecules. There is a law of necessity that works without design, without effort, without intelligence, and without progress." End quote. So he's essentially saying there is no one behind the universe. It just is. There's nobody moving planets and speaking things into being. There is no design. There's no clockmaker. It just is. And that was pretty rare during that time period. His most famous work is the Encyclopedia, which was a 28-volume work written to, as in his own words, change the general way of thinking. So he didn't want to just, produce a great book and have people read it. He really wanted to influence the way people thought. He had a lot of contributors to his encyclopedia. Many philosophers wrote for his encyclopedia, attacking religious superstition, promoting tolerance, and suggesting programs to improve human society, to make it more cosmopolitan, more reasonable, more humane, and on and on. And so Diderot was very important in helping to spread the Enlightenment. Beccaria was not French, he was actually Italian, and his main work addressed the prison system. He argued that torture, capital punishment, cruel and arbitrary punishment were very, very counterproductive and should not be used. He argued for the right to a speedy trial and that the punishment should fit the crime. So if you steal a piece of bread, you shouldn't have prison for life, or, lots of things like that. Because apparently during that time period, people got way more than one could ever imagine now for the smallest crimes. And he wanted to put an end to that because he viewed it as unreasonable. He also said that governments should seek the greatest good for the greatest number, which kind of ties into that idea that we were talking about earlier called utilitarianism. So the people we just studied were part of the earlier Enlightenment. And there was also something called the later Enlightenment, which began in the late 1760s. There were a few people who were very important, but none more important than Rousseau. Rousseau was an interesting character himself, probably even more interesting than Voltaire. He was born in Geneva, Switzerland, but he spent most of his life in France. He was not an aristocrat like a lot of the other intellectuals, and so he always felt insecure about that, always felt a bit out of place. He was very passionate about individual freedom, and he argued the opposite of most Enlightenment philosophers who believed deeply in progress and this idea of an advancing civilization. He thought that civilization actually corrupts people. He thought that people were born good, that people in their natural state, in their primitive state, are good and free and live as equal members of society. But civilization creates a situation where the strong crush the weak and destroy the freedom and equality of everybody else. So who is he really arguing against? If you remember Thomas Hobbes, who talked about the state of nature being, constant state of war, like I said before, kind of the idea that the Lord of the Flies was based on. This idea that people are constantly warring, that life is nasty, brutish, and short. Rousseau is really saying the opposite, that the state of nature is good and free, and it's civilization that corrupts us. So again, unlike Hobbes, who thought that civilization was necessary to keep a society in order, for Rousseau, the idea is to go back to a more primitive state and to return to, sort of this innocent state of nature. So he asks the question, why does inequality exist? Is inequality a natural thing? In essence, why is there evil in the world? What is the human being in the natural state, or the state of nature, as we mentioned? So he says, man is free, and everywhere he is in chains, and civilization is corrupt. So with these ideas, he has a kind of interesting view of government. He spoke of something called the general will, and he said only a good government formed by the people and governed by a, quote, general will, which is sort of a direct democracy, I suppose, where people agree to give up some of their individual rights in order to get something out of, the common good, or to create a common good. And unfortunately, this idea was misinterpreted or twisted by the leaders of the French Revolution and inspired Robespierre, who we will learn about a little bit later, to implement the Reign of Terror. So claiming to be the voice of the general will, or to represent the general will in France. Rousseau also wrote a book called Emile, which was a treatise on education, published the same year as his social contract work. And Emile was about a little boy able to discover nature directly and to learn by experience instead of by the books, that natural instincts are very important in education, and children should discover things on their own. He also argued for a balance between the heart and the mind, sentiment or feeling and reason. And so it's very interesting because he's also seen as the father of Romanticism, this idea that, or this movement that was sort of a reaction against the Enlightenment, which was very heavily focused on reason and logic and the scientific method. Romanticism was wanting to throw all that away and base everything on sentiment or feeling and emotion. And so he's an interesting bridge between the Enlightenment and another movement called Romanticism. Sadly, even though Rousseau wrote this treatise on education, and in fact, I believe that the Montessori system is sort of based on some of Rousseau's ideas, but it's interesting that he wrote very, I guess, tenderly about children, and ended up himself giving up all of the many children he had out of wedlock and having them placed in orphanages. So He was not an easy person. In fact, he didn't get along with most people. He was considered infantile and demanding, kind of like a screaming, temper tantruming kid. I know that's not really a word, but a kid who's constantly throwing temper tantrums. He was not a very mature adult, let's say. So I promised you we would talk about the role of women in Enlightenment thought. Well, most Enlightenment thinkers did not believe women were rational creatures. And interestingly enough, women were instrumental in spreading the Enlightenment through something called salons, where aristocratic women would invite very prestigious philosophers to come and lead discussions in their homes. And they would invite other aristocrats in the community to listen and ask questions. They were not really considered people who were able to conceive of any ideas themselves. So the Enlightenment thinkers challenged traditional views in general, but tended to take a very traditional view of the role of women. Rousseau, for example, said women shouldn't be educated except in how to be good wives and mothers. There were some women who challenged them. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was British, and Émilie du Châtelet, and again, I am faking the French accent because I have no idea how to pronounce anything French. Okay, so Mary Wollstonecraft, very interesting and strong, amazing woman. She wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which she published in 1792. And in your textbook, you can actually, or some of your textbooks, that is, you can read excerpts from this book. But essentially, she argues that women's education should be as important as men's, and that if nothing else, it will make them much better wives and much better mothers. So she also argued that women should be able to become anything they wanted to be, doctors, politicians, lawyers. And so she was very influential, one of the early feminists of the modern European world. In fact, some of you may decide you want to do your research paper on her. Émilie du Châtelet was a mathematician. She was a physicist and an author, and she was an aristocrat. She translated and wrote a commentary on Isaac Newton's work, Principia Mathematica, which, by the way, is still considered the standard French translation, or at least it was at the time I created the slideshow. So Voltaire actually declared in a letter to his friend, King Frederick II of Prussia, that Du Châtelet was a, quote, great man whose only fault was being a woman. Consequently, that was probably said tongue-in-cheek since they were having an affair, and it is well known that they respected one another greatly. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of Intro to the Enlightenment. Thank you for listening, for joining me, and I hope that you got something out of it.